You think you can just waltz into first class like you own the place? The blonde flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a knife, her platinum hair catching the overhead lights as she leaned down until her face was inches from the child's, close enough that he could smell the coffee on her breath, mixed with something sharper, something that tasted like contempt made manifest. This section is for paying customers, not freeloaders, who somehow gamed the system. The 9-year-old boy in seat 4A didn't flinch, even as other passengers turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence as the confrontation unfolded with the kind of slow-motion horror that makes witnesses freeze rather than intervene. His small hands remained folded in his lap, his boarding pass clutched between fingers that showed no tremor despite the public humiliation washing over him in waves that would have broken most adults, let alone a child traveling alone for the first time. "Ma'am, my father purchased this ticket," he said quietly, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who had been taught that speaking clearly and respectfully would protect him from exactly this kind of treatment, though that lesson was proving hollow with each passing second. Seat 4. A first-class Chicago to San Francisco confirmation number. "I don't care what your confirmation number says." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jessica Martin in letters that seemed to mock the very concept of hospitality, straightened to her full height and gestured toward the curtain separating first class from economy with the kind of dramatic flourish usually reserved for stage productions. System errors happen all the time, especially with last-minute bookings that raise red flags. And quite frankly, a child your age has no business sitting up here when there are perfectly good seats in the back where you'd be more comfortable with people more like you. She didn't say what she meant by people more like you, but she didn't need to because everyone in the first 3 rows heard it in the pause between words, saw it in the way her eyes traveled from his brown skin to his simple t-shirt to his worn sneakers, making calculations about worthiness that had nothing to do with the price of his ticket, and everything to do with assumptions she'd been carrying for so long they felt like facts. What none of them knew, what Jessica Martin, with her 15 years of seniority and her platinum hair and her absolute certainty about who belonged in her cabin, could not possibly have guessed, was that the quiet boy she was humiliating in front of a plane full of strangers was the son of the man who had founded the airline she worked for, the man whose signature appeared on every policy manual she'd ever ignored. The man who had built an empire specifically, so his children would never have to experience exactly what was happening right now. But Ethan Rivers had learned early that his father's wealth and power meant nothing when people looked at his face and decided what he deserved before he opened his mouth. That being the son of a billionaire tech mogul who revolutionized social media didn't protect him from strangers who saw a black child and assumed theft rather than legitimacy. And so he had developed the kind of quiet dignity that comes from understanding that you cannot control what people think about you, but you can absolutely control how you respond when they show you who they are. His father, Marcus Rivers, had taught him that through both words and example during the countless times they'd discussed what it meant to move through a world that would often decide Ethan's worth based on his appearance rather than his character. And those lessons were being tested now in ways that no 9-year-old should have to endure at 35,000 feet with nowhere to escape and no adult willing to intervene. The morning had started so differently with Ethan waking up in his bedroom in Palo Alto, to sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the San Francisco Bay, his packed suitcase waiting by the door for the trip to Chicago, where he would spend 2 weeks with his grandmother while his father attended a series of business meetings across Europe. Marcus had driven him to the airport himself, despite having a private jet at his disposal, because he believed his son should experience the world the way most people did, should understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that traveling commercial meant engaging with humanity in all its messy, beautiful, complicated reality, rather than hiding behind wealth and avoiding the experiences that built character and empathy. "Remember what we talked about," Marcus had said as they stood at the security checkpoint. his hands resting on Ethan's shoulders with the weight of both love and concern that came from being a black father sending his black son into a world that didn't always see children when it looked at brown skin. You belong anywhere you choose to be, and anyone who tells you different is revealing their own limitations, not yours. Jessica Martin was not finished making her point. Having decided that this child's quiet resistance to her authority required escalation rather than reflection, and she reached across Ethan to grab the menu that had been placed on his tray table by a younger flight attendant who hadn't yet learned that some crew members enforced rules that didn't exist in any manual. First-class passengers receive priority service and premium amenities that are wasted on children who wouldn't know the difference between champagne and sparkling cider, she announced loudly enough that her voice carried through the cabin like a proclamation, like she was performing for an audience rather than simply doing her job. You'll be much happier in economy, where the seats are designed for people who don't require the space and attention that our premium customers expect and deserve. The businessman in seat 3C lowered his Wall Street Journal just enough to peer over the top with eyes that held more curiosity than concern, watching the drama unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a situation that didn't directly affect him and therefore didn't require his intervention. Across the aisle, an elderly white woman clutched her purse closer to her body in an unconscious gesture that spoke volumes about the assumptions she was making about who might threaten her belongings, while the young couple in row 5 exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing. Their silence as loud as any words they might have spoken. Only one passenger seemed genuinely disturbed by what was happening, and that was Rosa Martinez, a 62-year-old retired federal judge who had spent 4 decades on the bench learning to recognize injustice in all its forms, from the blatant violations that made headlines to the subtle erosions of dignity that happened in everyday interactions when people with power decided that certain individuals didn't deserve basic respect. She sat in seat 5D with her tablet open to a legal brief she'd been reviewing, but her attention had shifted entirely to the confrontation unfolding 3 rows ahead. Her trained eye catching details that others might miss, the way Jessica's body language radiated aggressive authority, the way Ethan held himself with practiced stillness, the way other passengers were averting their eyes to avoid getting involved. "Excuse me," Rosa said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded courtrooms and didn't need to shout to be heard. "That child has a valid boarding pass for that seat, and unless you have specific evidence of fraud or system error, you have no grounds to relocate him based on your personal assessment of where he belongs." Jessica's head swiveled toward Rosa with the kind of sharp movement that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being challenged, her professional smile freezing into something harder and less pleasant. "Ma'am, cabin seating assignments are crew decisions, and interference with flight crew duties is a federal offense that can result in your removal from this aircraft," she said, deploying the threat with practiced ease as if she'd used this particular weapon before when passengers questioned her judgment. "I suggest you focus on your own travel experience and allow me to manage my cabin according to airline policy and my 15 years of experience in premium service. I am a retired federal judge," Rosa replied evenly, her voice never rising but somehow filling more space than Jessica's aggressive volume. "I know exactly what constitutes interference with crew duties, and I also know the difference between legitimate safety concerns and discriminatory treatment disguised as policy enforcement, so perhaps you should check that boarding pass more carefully before you continue this particular course of action." For just a moment, something flickered across Jessica's face, uncertainty perhaps, or the recognition that this wasn't going to be as easy as her previous encounters with passengers who challenged her authority. But it vanished quickly beneath a renewed surge of defensive anger. She turned back to Ethan, ignoring Rosa entirely, and pointed toward the economy section with a finger that trembled slightly with barely contained rage. "Last chance to move voluntarily before I call the captain and have you escorted off this plane entirely," she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow felt more threatening than her earlier volume. Your choice walk to economy now, or explain to your parents why you're being removed from the flight and banned from this airline. Ethan looked up at her with eyes that were dry despite the humiliation burning in his chest, eyes that held the same steady composure his father had modeled for him through countless difficult moments. My father taught me that belonging isn't something other people get to decide for me, he said quietly, each word carefully chosen and delivered with a dignity that should have shamed every adult who heard it. So I'll stay in my assigned seat until someone with actual authority and actual evidence of wrongdoing tells me otherwise, ma'am. The slap of Jessica's palm against the call button echoed through the first-class cabin with the finality of a gavel, summoning reinforcements for a battle she had already decided to win, regardless of facts or fairness, or the increasingly uncomfortable expressions on the faces of passengers who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something uglier than a simple seating dispute. Within seconds, the purser emerged from the forward galley, a thin man in his 40s whose name tag identified him as David Chen, his expression already molded into professional neutrality before he'd even assessed the situation or heard both sides of whatever conflict had prompted Jessica's urgent summons. We have an unauthorized passenger in first class, Jessica announced before David could ask any questions, her voice pitched loud enough to ensure everyone heard her framing of the situation. Seat 4, A claiming his father purchased the ticket. But I have serious concerns about the validity of this reservation, given the passenger's age and presentation, and he's refusing to comply with crew instructions to relocate to an appropriate seat assignment in economy where he would be more comfortable and where we have several open middle seats that would actually be better for an unaccompanied minor anyway. David's eyes moved from Jessica to Ethan, taking in the child's neat clothing and calm demeanor and the boarding pass still clutched in his hand, and for a brief moment something like doubt crossed his features before he glanced back at Jessica and seemed to make a calculation about hierarchy and seniority and the path of least resistance. "May I see your boarding pass, young man?" he asked Ethan, his tone carefully, neutral, neither warm nor cold, committed to nothing except getting through this interaction without creating problems for himself. Ethan handed over the boarding pass with steady hands, watching as David scanned it with the same device Jessica had presumably already used, watching as the screen confirmed what should have ended this entire confrontation: name: Ethan Rivers, Seat 4. A first class confirmed and paid in full, no flags or alerts or irregularities of any kind. David studied the screen for several long seconds, while Jessica stood beside him, radiating impatient certainty, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that suggested she'd already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for David to confirm her authority. "The reservation appears valid," David said slowly, and Rosa felt a flicker of hope that perhaps someone with authority would do the right thing. But then he continued, however, given the unusual nature of a child, this young, traveling alone in first class, and given the concerns raised by our senior cabin crew, I think it would be prudent to verify the payment method and guardian contact information before we take off. And in the meantime, we do have those empty seats in economy that would be more appropriate for an unaccompanied minor's safety and supervision." "More appropriate," Rosa repeated from her seat, her voice sharp enough to cut through David's carefully constructed reasoning. "You mean more appropriate for a child who looks like him, because I've been flying for 40 years and I've never once seen a white child in first class questioned about the validity of their ticket or relocated for their own safety." Jessica wheeled on Rosa with eyes that had gone hard and cold. "This is your final warning about interfering with crew operations," she snapped, abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy. "One more word and I will have law enforcement waiting at the gate in San Francisco to charge you with federal interference, and I will personally ensure that you never fly this airline again for as long as I have the authority to enforce our passenger conduct policies." The threat hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking, while other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats and studied their phones or their magazines or anything except the child being systematically stripped of dignity by adults who held all the power and felt no obligation to use it justly. Ethan's throat felt tight, his eyes burning with tears. He refused to let fall because his father had taught him that showing pain to people who wanted to hurt you only gave them satisfaction, only confirmed their belief that they had the right to diminish you, and he would not give Jessica Martin or David Chen or any of these silent witnesses the satisfaction of seeing him break. "Stand up," Jessica ordered, her voice carrying the brittle edge of someone who had won and knew it. "Gather your belongings and follow me to your new seat assignment, and if you continue to resist or cause disruption, I will have no choice but to recommend your removal from this flight entirely, and placement on the no-fly list for future travel." Ethan looked at David one last time, hoping for intervention that didn't come, looked at Rosa, whose hands had curled into fists on her armrests, looked at the businessman behind his newspaper and the elderly woman clutching her purse, and the young couple who had suddenly become fascinated by something outside their window. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt with hands that trembled only slightly, reached for his small backpack in the overhead bin, and stood in the aisle while Jessica's satisfied smile told him everything he needed to know about how little his dignity had mattered to someone who had decided his worth based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character or the validity of his ticket. The walk from seat 4A to seat 28F in the middle of economy felt longer than any distance Ethan had ever traveled, each step carrying him past rows of passengers who had witnessed his humiliation and chosen silence over solidarity, their averted eyes and studied indifference creating a gauntlet of complicity that hurt almost as much as Jessica's original accusations. She walked behind him rather than beside him, her heels clicking against the aircraft floor in a rhythm that sounded like judgment, like punishment, like the enforcement of invisible rules that said certain children belonged in certain sections, and any deviation from those unwritten codes required correction and public shame. Economy class was a different world entirely. Seats pressed closer together with less legroom and narrower aisles. The lighting somehow harsher, despite being technically the same fixtures, the very air feeling more compressed as if the oxygen itself was rationed differently based on ticket price. Jessica stopped at row 28 and gestured to the middle seat with the same flourish she'd used earlier, her satisfaction barely concealed behind a mask of professional efficiency. "Your new seat assignment?" she announced, though no one had asked. "I'm sure you'll find it much more suitable to your needs, and much less confusing than trying to navigate first-class service protocols that, frankly, weren't designed with children in mind anyway." The passengers on either side of 28F, a large man whose shoulders spilled into the middle seat space, and a woman whose bag occupied the floor area where Ethan would need to put his feet, looked up with expressions ranging from mild annoyance to indifference, neither one offering to make room or acknowledging the humiliation that had just walked down the aisle for everyone to witness. Ethan squeezed into the seat, his backpack pressed against his chest, because there was no overhead bin space remaining in this section, and buckled the seatbelt with hands that still refused to shake no matter how much his chest felt like it might collapse under the weight of injustice and helplessness. "Much better," Jessica said, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested she considered this matter resolved and herself vindicated. "A flight attendant will be by with economy service in approximately 30 minutes, and I trust we won't have any further disruptions or attempts to access areas of the aircraft that aren't included in your ticket class." She walked away before Ethan could respond. Not that he had words for what he was feeling. Not anger exactly, though that was certainly part of it, and not sadness alone, though his eyes burned with tears that still refused to fall, but rather a complicated mixture of shame that had been imposed on him through no fault of his own, and fury at the injustice of adults who wielded power without wisdom, and a desperate longing for his father, who would have known exactly how to handle this situation and would have protected him from having to endure it in the first place. He pulled out his phone. hands finally trembling now that Jessica was gone, and opened the messaging app to text his father. But the screen showed no signal at this altitude, the airplane mode icon mocking his need to reach across the miles to someone who could make this right. In Seat 5D, Rosa Martinez had watched the entire procession with her own phone held low in her lap, the camera recording every moment of Jessica's performance and Ethan's dignified walk to the back of the plane. Her jaw clenched with the kind of anger that comes from watching injustice unfold and being temporarily powerless to stop it. She had faced down corrupt prosecutors and incompetent defense attorneys and even her own colleagues when they tried to shortcut justice in the name of expediency. But she had never felt quite this particular flavor of rage at watching a child be systematically dehumanized by someone who should have been ensuring his safety and comfort, rather than punishing him for having the audacity to exist in a space she'd decided he didn't deserve. The businessman in 3C had returned to his Wall Street Journal, his brief moment of interest in the drama apparently satisfied now that normalcy had been restored and the uncomfortable situation had been resolved through the reassertion of what he probably thought of as proper order. The elderly woman had released her death grip on her purse, settling back into her seat with visible relief now that the perceived threat had been relocated to a safe distance, while the young couple in row 5 were already scrolling through their phones as if nothing significant had happened at all, as if they hadn't just watched a child be publicly humiliated and chosen comfort over conscience. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have guessed as the plane began its taxi toward the runway, and the captain's voice came over the intercom with the standard pre-flight announcements about weather and flight time and cruising altitude, was that Ethan Rivers' father had been tracking his son's flight through the airline's internal monitoring system, that he had received an automated alert the moment Ethan's seat assignment was changed without authorization, and that Marcus Rivers was already making phone calls that would ensure this particular flight became something very different from routine. Marcus Rivers stood in his corner office on the 38th floor of the Rivers Tech headquarters building, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of San Francisco Bay that he wasn't seeing because all his attention was focused on his phone screen and the notification that had just shattered what was supposed to be a routine morning of meetings and strategic planning sessions. The alert from Skylink Airlines' passenger monitoring system was clinical in its language. Seat reassignment: Rivers, Ethan, age 9, unaccompanied, minor. Original, 4. A, first class, reassigned 28F. Economy authorization. Crew, override reason. Passenger accommodation. But Marcus had spent enough years navigating corporate euphemisms to know that passenger accommodation was code for something that required his immediate attention. He had founded Skylink Airlines 8 years ago after selling his first tech company for an amount that made headlines and gave him the capital to pursue his actual passion, which wasn't writing code or building platforms, but rather creating infrastructure that connected people and made travel accessible and dignified for everyone, regardless of their background or appearance or the assumptions others made about them. The airline industry had been ripe for disruption, dominated by legacy carriers that treated passengers like cargo and employees like interchangeable parts, and Marcus had built Skylink on a foundation of respect and equity, and the radical notion that everyone deserved to be treated like a human being, rather than a seat number or a revenue calculation. Get me everything he said into his phone, his voice carrying the calm precision that people who worked for him had learned meant absolute urgency beneath a controlled surface. Full flight, manifest crew, roster, passenger complaint. History for everyone on duty, and I want the cabin camera footage from the moment my son boarded until the moment his seat was changed, and I want it in the next 10 minutes, not 11. Sarah Chen, his head of operations and the person responsible for passenger safety protocols across the entire airline, was already typing before he finished speaking, her fingers flying across her keyboard with the efficiency of someone who knew that when Marcus used that particular tone, everything else became secondary to resolving whatever situation had triggered it. Pulling it now, she confirmed, her voice coming through his phone speaker with slight distortion. "Marcus, the seat change was logged as crew discretion under accommodation protocols, but there's no corresponding incident report or safety concern flagged, which means either something went wrong with the documentation or someone decided my 9-year-old son didn't belong in first class and moved him to the back without bothering to verify who he was or whether the change was justified by anything except their own prejudices." Marcus finished, his hand tightening around his phone hard enough that the case creaked slightly under the pressure. "How long until the footage is available?" "Uploading to your secure portal. Now." Sarah replied, and Marcus could hear the clicking of her mouse as she navigated through whatever system housed the airline's security footage. "Marcus, I'm seeing the crew member who logged the change. Jessica Martin, senior flight attendant, 15 years with the airline, transferred from Legacy Air when we acquired their Pacific routes 3 years ago. Performance reviews generally positive, but with some notations about rigid interpretation of policies and several passenger complaints that were resolved informally through compensation rather than disciplinary action." Marcus was already pulling up the video footage on his laptop, watching his son board the plane with his backpack and his boarding pass, watching him find his seat and settle in with the careful movements of a child who had been taught to be considerate of others, watching as a blonde flight attendant approached, and the body language alone told Marcus everything he needed to know about how this was going to unfold. He turned up the volume and heard Jessica's voice cutting through the cabin with accusations about system errors, and freeloaders heard his son's careful response about his father purchasing the ticket. Heard the escalation from question to confrontation to public humiliation, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest with the weight of absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. "I want a complete investigation initiated immediately," Marcus said, his voice still calm but with an edge. Now that Sarah recognized as the tone that preceded major policy changes or personnel decisions that couldn't be undone. Full review of Jessica Martin's complaint history, detailed analysis of every seat reassignment she's logged in the past 3 years, and I want cross-reference with passenger demographics to see if there's a pattern, because I'm watching my son be told he doesn't belong in a seat I paid for on an airline I own. And if this is happening to him, then I guarantee it's been happening to other passengers who didn't have my resources or visibility to push back. The plane had taken off now, according to the flight tracking system Marcus had open in another window, climbing toward cruising altitude, while his son sat squeezed into a middle seat in economy, probably wondering why his father's promises about belonging anywhere hadn't protected him from a stranger who decided his brown skin meant he was lying about his ticket. Marcus had spent 9 years trying to shield Ethan from the worst of what the world threw at black children, building wealth and platforms and influence specifically, so his son could move through life with fewer barriers than Marcus himself had faced. And it had taken one flight attendant less than 10 minutes to prove that no amount of money or success could fully protect a black child from someone who had already decided he didn't deserve dignity. "I'm chartering a plane," Marcus said abruptly, making the decision even as he spoke the words. "I'll meet that flight when it lands in San Francisco, and I want James Peterson from legal and everyone on the passenger rights team assembled at SFO before the plane touches down, because we're going to handle this properly and we're going to handle it today." The beverage cart rattled down the economy aisle, pushed by a young flight attendant, whose name tag read Michael Torres, and whose expression suggested he'd been working long enough to develop the professional smile that never quite reached his eyes, but not long enough to have lost all trace of genuine care about passenger comfort. He stopped at each row with practiced efficiency, distributing tiny cans of soda and plastic cups of ice with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this exact sequence of movements thousands of times before, and when he reached row 28, his hands were already reaching for the next set of drinks, before his eyes registered the small figure pressed into the middle seat between 2 adults who had claimed all available space as if the child didn't exist. "What can I get you to drink?" Michael asked, his voice carrying automatic cheerfulness that faltered slightly when he actually looked at Ethan and saw something in the child's expression that suggested this wasn't a normal flight or a normal situation. Though he couldn't have articulated what exactly seemed wrong, except that 9-year-olds sitting alone in middle seats in economy usually had different energy than the quiet sadness radiating from this particular passenger. "Just water, please," Ethan said softly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft engines and the conversations happening around them. And Michael poured water from a plastic bottle into a plastic cup with ice and handed it over with a smile that became slightly more genuine when Ethan said, "Thank you, sir," with the kind of politeness that suggested good home training and parents who had taught their child that service workers deserved respect. Michael continued down the aisle, his cart bumping over the slight irregularities in the floor. But something about that interaction stayed with him, nagged at his attention in a way he couldn't quite shake, and when he returned to the galley to reload his cart for the next pass through the cabin, he found Jessica standing there reviewing her service notes with the satisfied expression of someone who had handled a difficult situation and expected praise rather than questions. "Everything smooth in economy?" she asked, without looking up her tone, suggesting the question was purely rhetorical, and she expected no answer except confirmation of her expectations. "There's a kid by himself in 28. F," Michael said carefully, measuring his words because he'd only been working for Skylink for 8 months, and Jessica had 15 years of seniority and a reputation for crushing crew members who questioned her decisions. "Seems pretty young to be sitting alone, and I thought I saw him board into first class earlier, so I was wondering if there was some kind of seat change or family situation I should be aware of for safety monitoring purposes." Jessica's head came up sharply, her eyes narrowing as she assessed whether Michael was genuinely asking for information or subtly criticizing her handling of the situation, and apparently she decided it was the latter because her voice went cold and clipped when she responded. That passenger was relocated due to ticketing irregularities and age-appropriate seating concerns. She said each word precise and final, leaving no room for follow-up questions. "I handled it personally, according to proper protocols, and there's no family situation except a child who needs to learn that first class is for passengers who have legitimately paid for premium service rather than gaming the system through fraudulent bookings or sympathy plays." Michael nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he recognized the tone that meant the conversation was over and pushing further would only create problems for himself without helping the kid in 28F, and he wondered how someone could look at a child sitting quietly in an assigned seat and immediately jump to assumptions about fraud and gaming. The system wondered what it was about that particular child that had triggered Jessica's certainty about illegitimacy, when he'd watched her serve plenty of other young passengers in first class without questioning their right to be there. Up in first class, Rosa Martinez had not stopped thinking about Ethan Rivers since watching him walk down that aisle with his small backpack and his carefully controlled expression, had not stopped feeling the burn of anger at her own temporary powerlessness to intervene more forcefully without getting herself removed from the flight and losing any ability to document or address what had happened. She had pulled out her tablet and drafted an email to Skylink's customer service department, detailing everything she'd witnessed with the precise language of someone who had spent decades writing legal opinions and knew exactly how to construct an argument that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. But she was also realistic enough to know that customer service complaints often disappeared into bureaucratic black holes where they died from neglect rather than malice. The elderly woman who had clutched her purse earlier had settled into watching a movie on her personal device, apparently having forgotten entirely about the disruption to her flight experience now that the source of her discomfort had been relocated to where she didn't have to see him. The businessman had fallen asleep behind his Wall Street Journal, his mouth slightly open and a thin line of drool beginning to form at the corner of his lips, while the young couple was engaged in an animated discussion about their vacation plans in San Francisco that involved restaurants and museums and all the careful planning that came from having the privilege to think about leisure rather than survival. Jessica moved through the first-class cabin with her service cart offering premium snacks and drinks with the warm smile she reserved for passengers she deemed worthy of her attention. stopping to chat with the businessman once he woke up and asking the elderly woman if she needed anything to make her flight more comfortable, performing the role of gracious host with practiced skill while Ethan sat 3 sections back with a cup of water and no snacks, because the meal service in economy hadn't started yet, and wouldn't for another 30 minutes at least. Captain Robert Harrison sat in the left seat of the cockpit, reviewing weather reports and fuel calculations, with the relaxed attention of someone who had logged over 20,000 flight hours and had long ago stopped finding routine flights particularly interesting. But his relaxed attention snapped into sharp focus when his radio crackled with a priority message from Skylink operations that came through on the secure channel reserved for situations that required immediate command decisions rather than standard communications. Flight 2847. This is Skylink operations. We have an urgent passenger welfare situation that requires your attention and possible course diversion. Please acknowledge. Robert exchanged glances with his first officer, a younger pilot named Jennifer Walsh, who had been in the middle of adjusting their altitude to avoid some light turbulence, but now sat motionless with her hand frozen on the controls, waiting for whatever was about to unfold. Skylink operations. This is Flight 2847. We acknowledge urgent message. Please proceed with details. Robert responded, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that pilots cultivate specifically for moments when things stop being routine and start being complicated. Captain Harrison. We have confirmation that an unaccompanied minor passenger was removed from his assigned first-class seat and relocated to economy without proper authorization or documentation. And we have reason to believe this action was motivated by discriminatory factors rather than legitimate safety or service concerns. The operations voice said, reading from what Robert assumed was a prepared statement because the language had the careful precision of something that had been vetted by lawyers. The passenger in question is Ethan Rivers, 9 years old, son of Marcus Rivers, who is the founder and CEO of Skylink Airlines and Mr. Rivers has requested that the flight be diverted to the nearest appropriate airport so that the situation can be addressed immediately and his son can be safely removed from what he considers a hostile environment created by crew misconduct. Robert felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence, because in all his years of flying he'd dealt with medical emergencies and mechanical issues and weather disasters, but he'd never had operations tell him that a crew member had apparently harassed the boss's kid, and now the boss wanted the plane turned around mid-flight. Operations. Can you confirm the crew member involved and whether there's any safety risk to other passengers or ongoing confrontation that would justify an emergency diversion versus continuing to destination and handling this on the ground in San Francisco? He asked, already running through mental calculations about fuel and alternate airports and passenger notifications. The crew member is Jessica Martin, senior flight attendant, currently working the first-class cabin, and there's no indication of ongoing confrontation or immediate safety risk. But Mr. Rivers has been very clear that he wants his son off that aircraft as soon as possible, and he wants the crew member responsible to face immediate consequences rather than continuing to serve passengers for the remainder of the flight operations, replied. And Robert could hear the stress in the controller's voice, because nobody wanted to be the person delivering messages from an angry CEO who also happened to own the airline they worked for. Jennifer had pulled up a map showing their current position and possible diversion airports, her finger tracing the route to Las Vegas, which was the closest major airport with the facilities to handle the passenger offloading and crew changes that this situation was going to require. We're about 45 minutes from Vegas, she said quietly, speaking to Robert rather than transmitting over the radio. Fuel is fine, weather is clear, and we could probably get this sorted faster with a diversion than trying to handle it after we land in San Francisco. But we've got 163 other passengers who are going to be significantly delayed by turning around. Robert nodded slowly, weighing the competing priorities: one child's welfare versus the convenience of over 100 other passengers. The founder's explicit request versus standard operating procedures that said you didn't divert flights except for emergencies. The knowledge that whatever decision he made right now was going to be scrutinized and analyzed and possibly litigated for months or years afterward. Operations, this is Captain Harrison. I'm making the decision to divert to Las Vegas, McCarran International Airport, based on passenger welfare concerns and CEO directive. He said the words coming out more certain than he felt. Please arrange for ground support, including passenger services and security to meet the aircraft, and notify Las Vegas, ATC, that we'll be requesting priority handling for an unscheduled landing. He switched to the cabin intercom and heard his own voice fill the aircraft with the announcement that passengers had learned to dread because it always meant delays and disruptions and explanations that never quite satisfied anyone's need to understand why their plans were being upended. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrison from the flight deck. We're experiencing a situation that requires us to divert our flight to Las Vegas instead of continuing to San Francisco. And I apologize for the inconvenience, but passenger safety and welfare is always our top priority. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 40 minutes, and Skylink will be providing information about rebooking and compensation once we've landed. The reaction from the cabin was immediate, and predictable groans and complaints and the rustling of phones being pulled out to check connections and cancel meetings and notify people waiting in San Francisco that arrival times were about to change dramatically. Jessica appeared in the cockpit doorway within seconds, her face flushed with confusion and anger. Captain, what's happening? Why are we diverting? She demanded, her voice carrying the edge of someone who sensed that something had gone very wrong, but didn't yet understand her role in it. Return to your station and prepare the cabin for landing, Robert said without looking at her, his attention focused on coordinating with air traffic control and beginning the descent into Las Vegas. You'll receive a full briefing once we're on the ground. The wheels touched down on Las Vegas runway with a slight screech of rubber against asphalt, the aircraft shuddering as the brakes engaged and the thrust reversers roared to life, slowing the plane from landing speed to taxi speed with practiced precision that Robert Harrison had performed thousands of times, but which felt different today, because he knew that waiting at the gate was a situation that would probably end at least one career and possibly reshape how Skylink Airlines handled discrimination complaints going forward. The tower directed them to a remote gate away from the main terminal, which told Robert that operations had arranged for this to be handled as discreetly as possible, given that the CEO's son was involved and nobody wanted camera phones capturing whatever confrontation was about to unfold. As the aircraft rolled to a stop and the engines spooled down to silence, Robert could see through the cockpit window that there were already several vehicles parked near the gate. 2 Skylink operations trucks, an airport security car, and a black SUV with tinted windows that probably contained Marcus Rivers himself, because Robert couldn't imagine the CEO delegating something this personal to subordinates when his 9-year-old son had been mistreated by someone wearing the airline's uniform. Operations Flight 2847 is parked at Gate Charlie 7, requesting instructions for passenger handling and crew procedures. He transmitted, not sure whether he was supposed to let everyone off or hold them on board, or what exactly the protocol was for this unprecedented situation. Captain Harrison, please hold all passengers and crew on board, except for Ethan Rivers, who will be escorted off first, and then we'll need Jessica Martin to deplane for an immediate meeting with management. Remaining passengers will be deplaned after the situation is resolved, and we have replacement crew in position. Operations replied, and Robert could hear shuffling papers and multiple voices in the background, suggesting there were a lot of people trying to figure out how to handle this without making it worse. Robert made an announcement asking all passengers to remain seated for a few minutes while they coordinated gate services, carefully not mentioning why they were actually delayed, because explaining that they'd diverted the flight because a flight attendant had racially profiled the CEO's kid seemed like the kind of information that would create more problems than it solved. In seat 28F, Ethan sat motionless with his backpack clutched against his chest. confused about why they'd landed in Las Vegas instead of continuing to San Francisco, but also feeling a small flutter of hope in his stomach, because diverted flights meant something important had happened. And maybe, just maybe, someone had noticed what Jessica had done to him and decided it mattered. The aircraft door opened with a mechanical hiss, and a Skylink operations manager appeared in the first-class section looking stressed and uncomfortable as he scanned the cabin for seat numbers. Ethan Rivers. He called out, his voice uncertain, and when no one in first class responded, he moved toward the curtain separating premium from economy, calling the name again with increasing urgency. "I'm here," Ethan said from row 28. His voice small but clear, and the operations manager's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise at finding the child so far back, confusion about how that had happened, and then anger as he apparently put together what must have occurred. "Can you come with me, please? Your father is waiting for you just outside the aircraft." Ethan stood up, squeezing past the large man whose shoulders he'd been pressed against for the past 90 minutes, pulling his backpack over both shoulders and walking up the aisle while every passenger watched with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Their earlier indifference replaced now by interest, because clearly something significant was happening, and the child they'd seen humiliated earlier was apparently more important than any of them had realized. Jessica stood near the forward galley, her expression cycling between confusion and the first hints of genuine fear as she watched Ethan walk past her toward the aircraft door, watched the operations manager's careful attention to the child's comfort, watched through the window as a tall black man in an expensive suit stepped forward to meet his son. Marcus Rivers had been standing on the tarmac for 20 minutes, his hands clenched in his pockets to keep from pacing his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining composure, when what he really wanted to do was storm onto that aircraft and demand answers from every single person who had watched his son be humiliated and done nothing to stop it. But he'd built a multi-billion-dollar company by learning to channel anger into action rather than reaction, and so he waited with forced patience, while lawyers and HR representatives and operations managers arranged the careful choreography of what was about to happen. The moment Ethan appeared in the aircraft doorway, all of Marcus's careful composure cracked just slightly enough that anyone watching could see the relief and fury and love that flashed across his face before he locked it down again. Ethan descended the stairs quickly, his small feet taking them 2 at a time, and then he was in his father's arms, being held tight enough that breathing became secondary to the simple comfort of being safe and protected and believed. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan whispered into Marcus's shoulder. "I tried to tell her the ticket was real, but she wouldn't listen, and she said I didn't belong there and everyone just watched, and nobody helped except one lady who tried, but Jessica threatened her too, and I didn't know what to do." "You did everything right," Marcus said quietly, his hand cupping the back of his son's head. "Everything that happened was wrong, but none of it was your fault, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Jessica Martin stood in the aircraft galley watching through the window as Marcus Rivers held his son on the tarmac below her mind, racing to piece together fragments of information that were beginning to form a picture she desperately didn't want to see. The child she'd removed from first class was apparently important enough to divert an entire flight, which meant his father was important enough to make airlines change course mid-journey, which meant the man in the expensive suit holding the boy was someone with serious power, and she had just made a catastrophic mistake by assuming the child didn't deserve to sit in a seat his father had purchased. Her hands had gone cold despite the warm air circulating through the cabin, and her mouth felt dry as she mentally reviewed every word she'd said to Ethan Rivers, every assumption she'd made about his worthiness and legitimacy, every moment when she could have checked more carefully or asked more questions or simply treated him with basic human decency instead of contempt. The operations manager who had escorted Ethan off the plane reappeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language radiating tension as he made eye contact with Jessica and gestured for her to come forward. "Miss Martin, I need you to deplane now for an urgent meeting with executive management, he said, his voice carrying the formal tone that people use when they're delivering bad news. They can't soften. And Jessica felt her stomach drop, because urgent meetings with executive management never ended well, and the fact that they were happening on the tarmac in Las Vegas instead of through normal channels meant this situation had escalated far beyond anything her seniority or service record could protect her from. She walked down the aircraft stairs on legs that felt disconnected from her body, each step carrying her closer to the small group assembled near the SUV, where Marcus Rivers stood with his arm around his son, and as she got closer, she could see that there were other people there too. A woman in a business suit who looked like legal counsel, 2 men with Skylink operations badges, and an airport security officer whose presence suggested this wasn't just a conversation, but potentially something that involved official violations and documented consequences. Marcus watched her approach with eyes that held no anger, because anger would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, his expression carried the cold weight of someone who had been forced to watch his child suffer, and was now calculating exactly how to ensure it never happened again. "Ms. Martin," the woman in the business suit said, stepping forward with a tablet in her hands. "I'm Sarah Chen, head of operations for Skylink Airlines, and I need to inform you that you're being placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation into your handling of passenger Ethan Rivers on Flight 2847. Specifically, your decision to remove him from his assigned first-class seat and relocate him to economy without proper authorization or documented safety justification." Jessica's mouth opened to defend herself, to explain that she'd been following her instincts about fraudulent bookings and inappropriate seating, to point out that she had 15 years of experience and had never been formally disciplined. But Sarah continued speaking with the relentless precision of someone who had prepared these statements carefully and wasn't interested in interruptions. "Our preliminary review of the cabin camera footage shows that you removed a valid ticketed passenger from his confirmed seat assignment based on what appears to be discriminatory assumptions about his age and appearance, rather than any legitimate policy violation that you made statements to multiple passengers suggesting the child had gained access to first class through fraudulent means, when in fact his ticket was purchased and confirmed weeks in advance, and that you threatened both the passenger and another customer who attempted to intervene on his behalf." "I didn't know he was—" Jessica started, but Marcus cut her off with a voice that was quiet, but somehow filled all the space around them. "You didn't know he was my son," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "That's exactly the problem, Ms. Martin. Because if you had known who his father was, you would have treated him differently, which means your decisions about who deserves dignity and respect are based on their connections and status rather than their humanity. And that tells me everything I need to know about how you've been treating passengers who don't have powerful parents to advocate for them." Jessica felt tears starting to form in her eyes, whether from shame or fear, or the overwhelming realization that her career was ending on a tarmac in Las Vegas. But crying wouldn't help her now, because the evidence was clear, and the victim was standing right there. And the CEO, whose airline she'd worked for, was looking at her like she represented everything wrong with an industry that still let prejudice masquerade as professional judgment. "I made a mistake." She whispered the words inadequate, but the only ones she could find. "I should have checked more carefully, should have listened to him, should have treated him better regardless of who his father was." "Yes, you should have." Marcus agreed, his arm tightening around Ethan's shoulders. "And the fact that you didn't. The fact that your first instinct was to assume a 9-year-old black child was lying or stealing rather than legitimately sitting in a seat he had every right to occupy. That tells me we have much bigger problems than one flight attendant making one mistake. Because I guarantee you've done this before to passengers who didn't have my resources or visibility. And I guarantee other crew members have done similar things because they learned from watching you that certain passengers can be treated as less deserving without facing real consequences." Sarah Chen held out her hand, palm up, waiting. "I need your crew badge access card and any Skylink property in your possession," she said, her voice carrying the finality of doors closing and bridges burning. "You'll receive formal notification of the investigation timeline and your rights within 24 hours, but effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties and barred from accessing any Skylink facilities or aircraft, and I should inform you that the company will be cooperating fully with any civil rights complaints or legal actions that result from this incident." Jessica unclipped her badge with shaking hands, the plastic rectangle that had represented her authority and identity for 15 years, suddenly feeling like evidence of her own failures, and handed it to Sarah along with the access card she'd used that morning to enter the crew area and the small Skylink wings pin she wore on her uniform lapel. Standing there in her wrinkled uniform on a Las Vegas tarmac with her career in ruins and a 9-year-old boy watching her face. The consequences of treating him as less than human. Jessica Martin finally understood that the problem had never been system errors, or protocol confusion, or passenger fraud. The problem had always been her own prejudices dressed up as professional judgment, and now everyone could see it. The investigation that followed Jessica Martin's suspension moved with the speed and thoroughness that only happens when a company founder makes something a personal priority and allocates unlimited resources to ensure no stone remains unturned, and what they found in Jessica's 15-year employment record painted a picture that was both damning and depressingly predictable for anyone who understood how discrimination works when it's allowed to hide behind professionalism and seniority. Sarah Chen's team pulled every passenger complaint that had ever been filed against Jessica, cross-referenced them with demographic data from the passengers involved, analyzed her seat reassignment patterns over the past 5 years, and reviewed hundreds of hours of cabin camera footage that showed how differently she treated passengers based on nothing more than their appearance and her assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins. The data was devastating in its clarity. Of the 47 passenger complaints filed against Jessica Martin over 15 years, 39 came from passengers of color, a statistical impossibility if her treatment of customers was truly unbiased, given that passengers of color represented only about 30% of Skylink's first-class customers on the routes she typically worked. The complaints followed familiar patterns. Black passengers denied meals or drinks that white passengers received automatically. Latino families told their children were being too loud, when white children playing similar games were ignored. Asian passengers having their English proficiency questioned, or being asked repeatedly if they understood instructions that had been perfectly clear, and in every case the complaints had been resolved through vouchers or refunds or apologies that never quite acknowledged the underlying discrimination, because that would have required someone to actually investigate whether Jessica's behavior represented a pattern rather than isolated misunderstandings. Marcus sat in his office reviewing these files with an anger that had crystallized into something colder and more focused than rage, because what he was seeing wasn't just one flight attendant's prejudices, but evidence of an organization that had allowed those prejudices to flourish through years of conflict, avoidance, and superficial resolution. Every voucher issued and apology sent, representing a decision to make the problem go away for that individual passenger, without addressing the reality that Jessica would continue treating other passengers the same way until someone finally forced real accountability. How many complaints were escalated beyond the customer service level, he asked Sarah, who sat across from his desk with her own laptop open to the detailed analysis her team had compiled. None. Sarah replied, her voice tight with frustration that mirrored his own. Every single complaint was handled through the standard customer service protocols, which meant offering compensation to make the passenger happy and marking the issue as resolved without any formal investigation or discipline for the crew member. And when I dug into the reasoning behind that pattern, I found that customer service representatives were explicitly trained to resolve complaints quickly and inexpensively, which meant vouchers were preferred over investigations because investigations took time and created documentation that could be used in lawsuits and generally made more problems than they solved from a business efficiency perspective. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the problem wasn't just Jessica Martin or even the broader issues of racial bias in service industries, but rather the entire structure of how his airline had been designed to handle passenger grievances, prioritizing speed and cost-effectiveness over justice and accountability, because someone had made a calculation that keeping crew members happy and avoiding conflict was more important than ensuring every passenger received equal treatment. "That changes today," he said quietly, opening a new document on his computer and beginning to type with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years building companies and knew exactly how to dismantle broken systems and replace them with better ones. "Every passenger complaint that involves discrimination claims gets escalated to a dedicated civil rights team with authority to launch full investigations. Every crew member gets annual bias training with their employment contingent on completion and demonstrated competence. And we create an independent passenger advocate position that reports directly to me, rather than filtering through operations or customer service, so there's no institutional pressure to minimize complaints or protect problem employees." Sarah nodded, making notes on her own tablet. "We should also consider reaching out to the passengers who filed previous complaints against Jessica and offering them the opportunity to participate in the investigation or pursue their own complaints, now that we have documentation of the pattern she suggested." And Marcus agreed immediately, because those passengers deserved to know that their complaints hadn't been ignored forever, that eventually someone had paid attention and taken action, even if it came years too late to help them individually. But even as they planned these reforms and drafted new policies and imagined a version of Skylink Airlines that truly lived up to its stated values of respect and equity, Marcus knew that systems and training and advocacy positions would never fully solve the problem of human prejudice, that there would always be people like Jessica Martin who looked at passengers and made calculations about worthiness based on skin color or accent or clothing or any of the 1,000 markers that people use to decide who deserves dignity and who can be dismissed. What mattered wasn't preventing every instance of bias, which was impossible, but rather creating structures that caught and corrected discriminatory treatment quickly, rather than allowing it to continue for 15 years and 47 complaints, and who knew how many other passengers who never bothered to file reports because they'd learned that complaining rarely changed anything. The investigation also revealed something else that Marcus found equally troubling, which was that several other crew members had witnessed Jessica's treatment of passengers over the years, but had never reported it or intervened because she had seniority and a reputation for retaliating against anyone who questioned her judgment. And the young flight attendant, Michael Torres, who had noticed something wrong with Ethan's situation on the diverted flight, came forward to say he'd seen Jessica relocate other passengers in ways that seemed questionable, but had been too new and too worried about his own job security to push back against someone who could make his life miserable, or even get him fired if she wanted to make the effort. This revelation led to additional policy changes around whistleblower protections and mandatory intervention requirements for crew members who witnessed discrimination, because creating a culture where bias could flourish required not just active perpetrators, but also passive bystanders who chose comfort over conscience. 3 weeks after the Las Vegas diversion, Skylink Airlines released a public statement acknowledging that one of their senior flight attendants had engaged in discriminatory treatment of passengers, including the CEO's son, announcing Jessica Martin's termination, and the implementation of comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar incidents and offering formal apologies and compensation to the 39 passengers whose previous complaints had been inadequately addressed. The statement was more honest and self-critical than most corporate communications, explicitly acknowledging that the airline had failed in its responsibility to protect passengers from discrimination and committing to ongoing transparency about their progress in addressing these structural problems. Rosa Martinez had not stopped thinking about Ethan Rivers since watching him walk down that aisle in defeat. And when she saw the news coverage of the diverted flight and the investigation that followed, she felt a complex mixture of relief that the child had ultimately been protected, and fury that it had taken his father owning the airline to make justice happen, when her own intervention as a retired federal judge hadn't been enough to stop the humiliation in real time. She had spent 40 years on the bench witnessing how justice worked differently for people with resources versus people without them, had seen countless cases where power determined outcomes more than facts or fairness. And this incident crystallized everything she'd been thinking about during the first year of her retirement, regarding how she wanted to spend whatever time and energy she had left in life. Within days of returning home from her disrupted trip to San Francisco, Rosa had reached out to 3 national civil rights organizations with a proposal that combined her legal expertise, her witness testimony about the incident, and her righteous anger about patterns of discrimination in commercial aviation that allowed situations like Ethan's to happen not just occasionally but regularly across airlines that treated passenger complaints as public relations problems rather than civil rights violations. I want to build a coalition focused specifically on airline discrimination, she told the director of the largest civil rights organization during their first phone call, her voice carrying the same authority it had held in courtrooms for 4 decades. We need systematic documentation of complaints across airlines, legal pressure to force meaningful policy changes rather than cosmetic reforms, and public awareness campaigns that help passengers understand they have rights and know how to enforce them when crew members engage in discriminatory treatment. The director, a woman named Patricia Williams, who had spent 20 years fighting workplace discrimination cases, immediately saw the potential in Rosa's proposal, because airlines represented a unique intersection of federal jurisdiction, corporate power, and daily interactions where bias could flourish under the cover of safety protocols and crew discretion. We've had individual cases over the years, Patricia explained, passengers removed from flights for speaking Arabic or wearing hijabs. Families separated because crew members decided children were being disruptive, when really they just didn't like seeing large Black or Latino families taking up premium seats. People with disabilities being told they couldn't fly because crew members made unilateral decisions about safety without proper medical consultation. But we've never had the resources or coordination to address this across the industry, rather than just fighting isolated battles that airlines settle quietly to avoid precedent. Rosa and Patricia spent 3 months building what they called the Airline Passenger Rights Project, recruiting volunteer lawyers from firms that wanted to contribute pro bono hours to civil rights work, developing intake systems for passengers to report discrimination experiences, creating educational materials that explained the legal protections that existed under civil rights law and aviation, consumer protection regulations, and most importantly, establishing relationships with sympathetic members of Congress who could apply pressure for regulatory changes that would make airlines take discrimination complaints seriously. The project's first major initiative was publishing a report that compiled data from thousands of passenger complaints across all major U.S. airlines, demonstrating that discrimination in seating service and removal decisions wasn't isolated to Skylink or to Jessica Martin, but rather represented an industry-wide pattern that had persisted for decades with minimal accountability. The report made headlines because Rosa had learned during her judicial career how to present data in ways that media couldn't ignore, using specific stories like Ethan's alongside statistical analysis that showed passengers of color were 3 times more likely to be removed from flights or have their seat assignments changed compared to white passengers, even when controlling for ticket class and frequent flyer status, and the combination of human narrative and hard numbers made it impossible for airlines to dismiss the findings as anecdotal complaints from passengers who just didn't understand proper procedures. Marcus Rivers publicly endorsed the report and committed Skylink to cooperating with the project's recommendations, which put pressure on other airline CEOs to either match his commitment or explain why they were less concerned about discrimination than a competitor who had been directly embarrassed by one of his own crew members. Congressional hearings followed, with Rosa testifying alongside other passengers who shared stories that ranged from humiliating to dangerous. The diabetic woman denied permission to retrieve her insulin from an overhead bin because a flight attendant decided she was being difficult. The elderly Sikh man removed from a flight because another passenger felt uncomfortable with his turban. The black physician questioned about whether her medical degree was real when she offered to help during an in-flight emergency. Each story representing not just individual harm, but proof of how bias worked, when people with authority made split-second decisions based on stereotypes rather than facts. The hearings led to new FAA regulations requiring airlines to maintain detailed records of all passenger removals and seat reassignments with demographic data that could be audited for patterns, mandating annual bias training for all crew members with testing to ensure comprehension rather than just attendance, and creating a federal complaint system where passengers could report discrimination directly to regulators rather than relying on airlines to investigate themselves. But Rosa knew that regulations and training would only go so far, that real change required cultural shifts in how crew members thought about their authority and how passengers understood their rights. And so the Airline Passenger Rights Project also focused on grassroots education through social media campaigns and community workshops that taught people what to do when they experienced or witnessed discrimination at 35,000 feet. Document everything with your phone if it's safe to do so became one of the project's key messages, along with ask for badge numbers and written explanations and file complaints with both the airline and the federal government. And know that you have the right to be treated with dignity regardless of what you look like or where you're sitting. The impact rippled through the industry faster than Rosa had expected, with flight attendant unions responding to the pressure by developing their own anti-discrimination training programs that went beyond legal compliance to address the underlying biases that led crew members to make assumptions about passengers based on appearance, and several airlines creating passenger advisory boards that included civil rights advocates and community representatives who could provide ongoing feedback about policies and practices that might inadvertently enable discriminatory treatment. Ethan Rivers sat in his father's home office 3 months after the Las Vegas diversion, his legs dangling from a chair that was too tall for him, watching as Marcus reviewed the latest implementation reports from Skylink's new passenger rights initiatives, and feeling a complicated mixture of pride and sadness that his own humiliation had sparked changes that might protect other children from experiencing what he'd endured. The nightmares had mostly stopped, though. Sometimes he still woke up feeling the pressure of being squeezed into that middle seat in economy with strangers on both sides, and Jessica Martin's voice echoing in his head, telling him he didn't belong anywhere except the back of the plane. But his therapist said that traumatic memories took time to process, and what mattered was that he was learning to talk about his feelings rather than pushing them down where they could fester into shame. Dr. Patterson says I shouldn't feel guilty about what happened to Ms. Martin Ethan said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the office while Marcus worked. She says that grown-ups are responsible for their own choices, and I didn't make Ms. Martin treat me that way. But sometimes I think about her losing her job, and I wonder if maybe I could have done something different that would have made her see me as just a kid instead of whatever she thought I was. Marcus stopped typing and turned his chair to face his son, directly recognizing this conversation as one of the important moments that defined how trauma either breaks people or teaches them strength, depending on how the adults around them respond. You were a 9-year-old child sitting in a seat your father paid for being polite, and following all the rules he said carefully, and nothing you could have said or done would have changed what Jessica Martin saw when she looked at you. Because her assumptions about who deserves respect weren't based on your behavior, but on her own prejudices that she'd been carrying for years before you ever stepped onto that plane. But if I'd just moved when she first asked. Ethan continued working through the thoughts that had been circling in his mind during therapy sessions and quiet moments. When he replayed the incident, trying to find a version where he could have prevented everything that followed. If I'd just gone to economy without arguing, she wouldn't have gotten so mad, and she'd still have her job, and the plane wouldn't have been diverted, and all those other passengers wouldn't have been delayed. Marcus felt his chest tighten, because this was the insidious thing about discrimination. It taught victims to blame themselves for the perpetrator's choices, made children believe they were responsible for adult prejudices, convinced people that acceptance of mistreatment was somehow nobler than demanding dignity. "Let me tell you what would have happened if you'd just moved," Marcus said, leaning forward so Ethan could see the absolute certainty in his eyes. Jessica Martin would have treated the next black child who sat in first class exactly the same way, and then the next one, and the one after that, because nothing in her behavior would have changed, and she would have learned that she could remove passengers based on race without facing any consequences, which means your silence wouldn't have protected her job, it would have enabled her to keep hurting people. "So, by standing up for myself, I was protecting other kids?" Ethan asked, wanting to believe this narrative that turned his pain into purpose, but not quite able to shake the feeling that maybe everyone would have been better off if he'd just been less difficult. "You were being true to yourself and refusing to accept mistreatment that was wrong," Marcus corrected gently. And yes, that refusal created a situation where Jessica's pattern of discrimination finally had to be addressed, instead of being covered up with vouchers and apologies. But the primary reason you should feel good about how you handled yourself is that you maintained your dignity and your sense of self-worth even when a powerful adult was telling you that you weren't good enough for the seat you were sitting in. They sat together in silence for a moment, father and son processing the complicated reality that justice often comes at a cost and healing isn't linear, and sometimes doing the right thing feels terrible in the moment, even though history proves it was necessary. Ethan had started a journal at Dr. Patterson's suggestion, writing down his feelings about the incident and the aftermath, and one of his recent entries had said, "I wish I could tell Ms. Martin that I forgive her, but I don't think I do yet." And Dr. Patterson says that's okay, because forgiveness isn't something you owe people who hurt you, just to make them feel better about what they did. "I got an email from a mother in Atlanta," Marcus said, changing the subject slightly but staying in the same emotional territory. "She said her 13-year-old daughter was on a flight last week when a flight attendant tried to move her from first class to economy, but this time the daughter knew to ask for written documentation of the safety concern that required the move, and when the flight attendant couldn't provide any legitimate reason, the captain intervened and let the girl stay in her assigned seat, and the mother said she'd learned about passenger rights from the airline passenger rights project that Ms. Martinez started after your flight." Ethan's face brightened slightly, a small smile breaking through the serious expression he'd been wearing. "So something good came from it," he said, and it was both a question and a statement, a child trying to make sense of suffering by finding meaning in outcomes. "Something good is coming from it," Marcus agreed, "but that doesn't make what you went through okay, and you don't have to be grateful for trauma just because other people learned from it." Within 18 months of Ethan Rivers's humiliation on Flight 2847, every major U.S. airline had implemented bias training programs that went beyond legal compliance to address the deep-rooted assumptions crew members made about passengers based on appearance, and the Federal Aviation Administration had established an independent office dedicated to investigating discrimination complaints with the authority to fine airlines that showed patterns of civil rights violations, and most importantly, thousands of passengers who had previously accepted mistreatment as the price of flying now understood they had rights worth defending, and advocates willing to help them enforce those rights. The Airline Passenger Rights Project that Rosa Martinez founded grew from a small coalition of volunteers into a nationally recognized organization with staff attorneys in 15 cities, and a hotline that fielded over 3,000 calls in its first year from passengers seeking help with everything from overt discrimination to subtle patterns of differential treatment that had previously been dismissed as unfortunate misunderstandings rather than acknowledged as civil rights violations requiring accountability and change. Jessica Martin never worked in aviation again, her termination and the detailed investigation findings becoming part of her permanent employment record that made her unemployable in any customer-facing role where bias could cause harm. And while some people argued that one mistake shouldn't define a person's entire career, The evidence showed this hadn't been one mistake, but rather a 15-year pattern of treating passengers of color as less deserving of dignity than white passengers, each incident representing a choice to let prejudice guide professional judgment, until finally someone with power refused to let those choices continue without consequences. She issued one public statement 6 months after her termination, a carefully worded apology that acknowledged her serious errors in judgment and expressed regret for the pain she'd caused Ethan and other passengers. Though notably, the statement never used the word racism or admitted that her treatment of passengers had been motivated by racial bias, rather than what she still characterized as legitimate concerns about policy compliance and cabin management. Ethan returned to school in Palo Alto, carrying a kind of quiet strength that his teachers noticed but couldn't quite name, the resilience that comes from surviving public humiliation and watching adults you trusted fail to protect you, and then ultimately seeing justice happen, even though it came too late to prevent the trauma. And he started a student organization called Dignity Matters that taught younger kids about their rights and helped them practice advocating for themselves when adults treated them unfairly, because he understood from personal experience that children needed tools and language and confidence to push back against authority figures who assumed compliance based on age or appearance or any other factor that had nothing to do with actual wrongdoing. His father watched him grow through this experience with the complicated emotions of a parent who would have given anything to spare his child that pain, but recognized that the person Ethan was becoming, thoughtful, empathetic, committed to justice, had been shaped in part by facing injustice and choosing to transform it into something meaningful, rather than letting it define him as a victim. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel, because Ethan's experience wasn't unique or even unusual. It happens every day on flights across the country when crew members make split-second decisions about who deserves respect, based on calculations that have nothing to do with tickets or policies and everything to do with prejudices we like to pretend don't exist anymore. And the only thing that makes some of these stories end differently is whether anyone with power decides to look closely enough to see the pattern, instead of dismissing each incident as an isolated misunderstanding that can be resolved with a voucher and an apology that costs nothing and changes nothing. Share this with someone who needs to remember that silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality. It's choosing the side of whoever has more power. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to look away when a child is being told they don't belong in a seat they paid for, because belonging isn't something that should ever depend on how much money your father has or who he knows or whether he owns the airline.